Okay, so we'll be watching this, and people won't realize that this is the second take on the interview part of it. And
Yeah.
the question was, if you could go back to a point in your life and kind of relive it, either a day or like a small period of days. And in the original interview, you had spoken about going back to 1992, or 91, 92, to
Yeah.
the period of the Rodney King incident. So I don't want to try and recap what we originally talked about, but I don't know, just try and sum up your idea of why you picked that, I guess.
So I think I could have gone in many different ways. I could have gone a real super personal way. And I decided to do something that was a little more outside of myself, but is also very personal and sort of affects, affects my life and the trajectory of my life since then. Even though it's sort of like a shared event with many other people. I chose that because I think it's one of those moments where you become aware of what's happening around in your world, and as a young person, you're introduced to adulthood with really kind of this idealism, or in my case, I was ideal, and so cynicism went away and idealism came through, and as you start to really reflect on what's happening around you, you realize things aren't quite as square as they should be. And I think at that moment, it became very apparent and to the whole country and the whole world that things are not square with people of color, specifically black people, in regards to race. And I think you look at when you're going through school and you learn about the civil rights movement and the social justice that happened in the 60s, in beginning in the 50s, but throughout the 60s, you really start to go, yes, that's right, and that's really kind of giving you a lot of to be proud of in terms of our country. But then you realize that years later, things aren't so good. And I guess for me, we were at that moment again, where you realize things aren't so good, and it's almost like in 1992, not enough people were listening, or they were, in my case, listening and paying attention, but then we thought we kind of got away from that, and we thought we had a good period of prosperity from 92 onwards with the new president. So I think with that prosperity, it kind of washed over the problems.
Sure, yeah.
And I think for me, going back in time, I would have loved to have recognized that moment with a little more clarity, and that would definitely have changed how I would have addressed the issue of race in our country much earlier and much more forcefully, rather than now.
Sure.
And I think it's one of those things where, as an educator, I was doing that individually and anecdotally, as sort of carrying that torch, but almost in isolation in a lot of ways, because people didn't want to talk about race, and people didn't really, at least the people I was surrounded by. But I think it's one of those things where if I had gone back at that moment, I felt I would have connected with people that were the forefront. I think people like Angela Davis, for example, who was the professor at the time, and leading civil rights leader in the area, and that would have been someone to reach out to and learn from, and we didn't have the internet to make it super easy to do those types of things, but I would have sought those things out if I could go back. And I think being a person of color and identifying, and this is not necessarily everyone's experience, but even though my experience as an Asian person or Asian heritage in this country, I've always identified with people of color and quote the experiences that minorities have endured historically, and it's one of those things that I'm not sure why I was so deep rooted with myself. Maybe because my parents went through the Jim Crow era, even though they were not subject to the Jim Crow laws, because here in California we didn't subscribe to that BS. But it was still there. It was still here in terms of redlining, and certainly with how people were sort of forced to live in certain places. So just that, all that stuff's just wrong. And I think 92, it was sort of a huge red flag that it's still wrong. And of course now, all the flags are up.
I don't know. It's definitely an open question. Are we going to learn even from what's happening now? You know?
Yeah, and I think that's a good thing to think about that and reflect on. And I think with this moment, it just clarifies a little more how every generation needs to do their work if they want to maintain our freedoms and hold on to our rights in this country and social justice. And each generation needs to be engaged more or less. I think that's a good way of looking at it, and people sort of miss that. But I think in kind of going back to 1991, 92, it's how did we let that continue as a society? Now, granted, since then we've had lots of progress. For example, Barack Obama being the first black president elected to the office, and I think that sort of showed, as well as someone like Colin Powell, that America has, I guess, held its promise to those opportunities for equality. But I think the distinction now is focused on equity as well.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, is there's a difference, between equality and equity.
Yeah, and I think that nuance it's not really a nuance, but I think understanding that there's more work that needs to be done, clearly.
Well, I guess the nice thing, just to kind of end on it, is that, we can't time travel, but we can do that now, Like, we can pick it up now and realize it, and kind of, you look to the past and say, what would I have done differently? It's like, you can't go back there and do it differently, but you can do it today, and you can do it tomorrow. So I think that's one of the great things about the beauty of what you picked,
As sitting in my studio again and watching this time lapse of the drawing I made during our original interview, which is not the one that you just heard, but the same topics were covered. And I had this thought at the time, about halfway through the drawing, that I've decided to draw a city on fire. And what does that say imagery-wise about all those things that my friend was just mentioning, about the experience of himself and his desire to go back and learn more from that time? And he's a little bit older than me, so he was in college when these incidents took place, and I was in the 6th grade. And the only thing that I remember visually from the time was news footage and newspaper photographs of Los Angeles on fire. And you think about that image burned into the brain of people around the country, but for me, being a white male, it paints a certain picture that I think is part of the problem in a lot of ways. And that burning a city and truly rioting is the ultimate expression of frustration. And if you only present that as the picture, the expression of what was happening, I think a lot of young people especially don't realize that people rioted because of the acquittal of the police, not because of the beating. It was the police were not held accountable, and then the people protested, and then it moved on to something more violent. And I think the difference today is now you see violence push the other way against peaceful protesters. And things have really changed in that respect. I think that this image of a city on fire frightens those in power. So I wanted to make that point clear that this is it ended up being a provocative image to pick for what he was saying. I mean, what he's talking about is knowledge and tolerance and, activism, and caring, compassion. And I don't think that comes across in the drawing at all. So it's interesting when you do a project like this that, you'll try and capture something and miss. Or maybe you'll end up expressing something you don't really feel. That just doesn't come together. I think the drawing's fine, and I kind of like some of the ideas in it. But it's more of a washing, I guess, of the image that I have in my mind of those events. And now I think about it in a different way because I know more than I did when I was in the 6th grade. But that image is still burned, no pun intended, into my memory. So technically, this is a watercolor on heavy drawing paper and a black ballpoint pen, kind of going over the top and putting all the details in and such. Total with the original interview and the drawing time, I think this is about an hour and 20 minutes, something like that. I think it'd make a fine painting, either scale up into acrylic or something, but maybe change some of the wording in there, make it a little bit a juxtaposition against the violence of the image and the misrepresentation of the image. Maybe some words of hope instead of questions. I don't know. There's always different ways you can take art. I really love doing these interviews and then basing this artwork off of them. Whatever happens, it just gets your mind going, and you get to talk to interesting people about things maybe you wouldn't come up in a normal conversation. You know somebody who's got good stories, and good stories make wonderful artwork almost every time. It's a white ballpoint pen going over the top for some details. I like doing this kind of work without looking at a reference either for any kind of, is that a real building in Los Angeles or anything like that. Especially it keeps the memory. I don't feel like it needs to be representative of anything in reality. Because in my head I can't see those details in the newspaper photographs. If I were to look at them again, they'd look different than I remembered. So I suppose the memory looks like something like this to me.